Then we move on to specification number 7, which asks us to explain why the transfer of energy from one trophic level to another is inefficient. Before we understand why energy transfer is inefficient, let's first understand what trophic levels are. Trophic levels are the feeding positions that organisms occupy in a food chain, food web, or ecological pyramid. They show how far an organism is from the original source of energy, which is the sun. Producers always occupy the first trophic level because they make their own food through photosynthesis. Primary consumers, which are herbivores, occupy the second trophic level. Secondary consumers, which feed on herbivores, occupy the third trophic level, while tertiary and quaternary consumers occupy the higher trophic levels. In a food web, some animals may feed at more than one trophic level because they consume different types of organisms. Now let's look at how energy flows through these trophic levels. Energy enters every ecosystem as light energy from the sun. Producers absorb this light energy and convert it into chemical energy through photosynthesis. When consumers feed on producers or other consumers, this chemical energy is transferred from one organism to the next through feeding. Energy always flows in one direction, beginning with the sun and eventually leaving the ecosystem as heat. Unlike nutrients, which are continuously recycled, energy cannot be recycled and therefore requires a constant supply from the sun. For energy to pass from one trophic level to the next, one organism must consume another. However, not all of the energy stored in an organism is transferred. Some parts of the organism, such as bones, roots, feathers, or shells, may not be eaten. Even the food that is eaten is not completely digested, and only the energy stored in newly formed body tissues, known as biomass, can be transferred to the next trophic level. Now let's understand why this transfer of energy is inefficient. The main reason is that a large proportion of energy is lost at every trophic level. A significant amount of energy, sometimes around 60%, leaves the body as undigested material in feces and is therefore never absorbed. Another large proportion, around 30%, is used during respiration and released as heat while carrying out life processes such as movement, growth, and maintaining body temperature. As a result, only about 10% of the original energy is converted into new biomass, and this is the only energy available to the next trophic level. Energy is also lost in several other ways. Organisms use energy for movement, heat production, especially in warm-blooded animals, and the production of waste products such as urine. In addition, uneaten body parts and undigested food are not transferred to the next consumer. Instead, these materials become food for decomposers, which recycle nutrients but do not recycle energy. To summarize the trophic levels, the producer occupies the first trophic level and produces its own food through photosynthesis. The primary consumer occupies the second trophic level and feeds on producers. The secondary consumer occupies the third trophic level and feeds on primary consumers. The tertiary consumer occupies the fourth trophic level and feeds on secondary consumers. Decomposers do not belong to a single trophic level because they break down dead organisms and waste materials from every level of the food chain. Because so much energy is lost at each trophic level, less and less energy is available as we move higher up the food chain. This is why food chains are usually short, containing only 4 or 5 trophic levels. There simply is not enough energy to support many organisms at the top. For example, if a predator fed on a barn owl, it would receive very little energy and would have to consume many owls just to survive, making such a food chain inefficient and impractical. Now, let's interpret the first diagram. As you can see, the energy pyramid begins with producers, represented by plants. These plants capture solar energy through photosynthesis and convert it into chemical energy stored in their tissues. The primary consumers, represented by the cow, obtain this energy by feeding on plants. The secondary consumers, represented by the snake, obtain energy by eating herbivores, while the tertiary consumers, represented by the eagle, receive energy by feeding on secondary consumers. Notice that only about 10% of the energy at one trophic level is transferred to the next. The remaining 90% is lost to the environment, mainly as heat produced during respiration, movement, growth, and other metabolic activities. This explains why the amount of available energy decreases at every higher trophic level. Now, let's look at the second diagram. This diagram also demonstrates ecosystem energy transfer using the 10% rule. Producers capture the greatest amount of energy from sunlight and form the base of the pyramid. As energy moves to the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, only about 10% is passed on at each stage, while the majority is lost as heat to the environment. The diagram also highlights the important role of decomposers. Decomposers break down dead plants, animals, and waste materials, returning nutrients to the soil where they can be reused by producers. It is important to remember that nutrients are recycled, but energy is not. Energy flows through the ecosystem only once before eventually being lost as heat, which is why a continuous supply of energy from the sun is essential for sustaining life.